Hello and welcome to this Innovation Fund tutorial. In this tutorial we will walk through an example of the application of the GHG calculator tool for an energy-intensive industries project application. During the application for the Innovation Fund, project proposals will be assessed against several criteria. Greenhouse gas or GHG emissions avoidance is one of them. Applicants must estimate the GHG emission avoidance based on the Innovation Fund's GHG methodology and using the relevant Excel calculator tool. Both are published on the funding and tender portal. If you haven't already done so, we recommend reading the GHG methodology before watching this tutorial. If you still have questions after watching this tutorial, do consult the FAQs in the funding and tenders portal, or consider contacting the dedicated help desk. The Energy-Intensive Industries Calculator is for use by applicants with projects in the EII category, which can include hybrid projects. The tool includes 12 tabs, but not all projects will need to fill out all tabs. In this tutorial, we will show you how to use the calculation tool to assess the GHG savings from an example methanol production project, with elements of biomass use and the utilization of captured carbon. Before I start, please take note that this is only an example using illustrative values and does not represent an actual operational process. If you scrutinize the numbers we've used very closely, you may find that some of the stoichiometry isn't precise, or that some of the energy use assumptions might not exactly reflect real versions of these processes. The purpose of these tutorials is to illustrate the sort of calculation you will have to do for your projects, not to come up with a real project design, so please don't be too put out if you see a detail that you consider unrealistic. I'm afraid though that when you provide calculations for your real projects, they need to be fully consistent. First tab of the Excel workbook provides an overview of the tool. Here you can find guidance for using the tool, definitions of some of the terms used, and a list of EII sectors and of associated principal products. You will also see that there is a color code provided for the tool. Light blue indicates cells where you may need to enter data. Green indicates cells that will show calculated values after you have entered the relevant data. Yellow cells indicate a choice from a list of options. Finally, light gray cells indicate spaces to document your calculations. The second tab of the tool is a summary tab. Here, you will be able to enter the high-level details about your project. Once we have filled in the tool, this table will show us the overall results for our example project. The principal product is methanol, and for this example we're going to assume that the produced methanol is supplied into the chemicals market as a substitute for conventionally produced methanol. From the list of possible sectors, we choose chemicals. From the list of principal products, given that methanol is an organic molecule, we choose organic basic chemicals. The function of the principal product is methanol for use as a chemical. In the rest of this tutorial, we will focus on how to fill in the tabs to calculate the project and reference emissions, including the calculation of a carbon capture credit. The first thing we're going to do is look at the process that we're going to be assessing, and state some basic assumptions that will drive our analysis. You should include a process diagram on the Process Diagram tab of the calculator. The purpose of the process diagram is to help the evaluators understand your application. The clearer your application is, the less likely the evaluators are to flag apparent weaknesses in your calculations. The process diagram can be a schematic diagram of your process units and flows. For this example, I have included a schematic process illustration. The process we are modeling today is based around a partial oxidation reactor, an electrolyzer, and a methanol synthesizer. The partial oxidation reactor takes in biomethane from a third-party supplier, and oxygen that is produced as a byproduct of the project's electrolyzer. It outputs synthesis gas consisting of hydrogen and carbon monoxide. The heat needed for this process is supplied by a natural gas boiler. This synthesis gas is then fed into a methanol synthesizer unit along with extra hydrogen from an electrolyzer, and carbon dioxide captured from a fossil source outside the project boundary. We can mention in passing that partial oxidation and methanol synthesis are exothermic reactions, and therefore any recovered heat could potentially be used instead of needing a boiler. However, for the sake of this example, we're assuming that a natural gas boiler is part of the process design. Notice that the process diagram shows several inputs being brought in from outside the system boundary. These are the biomethane feed for the POX reformer, process water, grid electricity, the fossil flue gas containing CO2, and the catalysts for the synthesis process. The diagram also includes the end of life of the methanol, which is the CO2 released during the final disposal of the carbon in the methanol molecules. In this example process diagram, I haven't fully quantified the various flows, but if you provide a process diagram in your calculation, you are encouraged to include quantities as well as schematic information to help the evaluators assess the process. Innovation Fund applications relate to projects that are not yet operational, and you must therefore adopt appropriate assumptions about the operational performance of your project in order to calculate the project scenario emissions. You will also need to make some assumptions in order to calculate the reference scenario emissions. These assumptions should be documented in the Assumptions tab of the calculator. Any failure to explain your assumptions, or the use of unrealistic assumptions, will be treated as a serious weakness and could lead to project application failure. As I mentioned earlier, in this tutorial we are outlining an example based on illustrative assumptions. Do bear in mind that for a real project you will need to provide supporting documentation and justifications for the assumptions that you use. Let's have a look at our numerical assumptions then, which you can see I've already filled in. We won't go through everything in detail, but we can see the sort of assumptions that have been included. There's quite a lot of information here, because in this methanol production case, we're modeling a moderately complex set of processes. There's no limit on the number of assumptions you can include in your own applications, so please include whatever is necessary to document your project. The first assumption listed here is the methanol output of the plant at full capacity. For the example, we'll set that to 100,000 tons per year. Following this, there are parameters relating to the rate at which the project is expected to reach full capacity. Other assumptions listed here include consumption rates for some of our process units, for example biomethane consumption by the POX reactor, and the energy conversion efficiency of the electrolyzer. There is also the rate of catalyst consumption, the water consumption for the electrolyzer, the water required for cooling the methanol synthesizer, and a value for CO2 venting from the methanol synthesizer. Having entered our assumptions, let's take a moment to remind ourselves of the equation to calculate GHG emissions reductions. The GHG calculator implements the calculation shown schematically here. By filling in the calculator, we are going to calculate the difference between the emissions that would occur from 10 years of methanol production under the reference scenario, as seen on the left. This includes the sum of emissions from inputs, processes, and end-of-life stages. We will then compare these to the emissions that will occur over 10 years in our project scenario. This includes the sum of inputs, processes, change to in-use emissions, and end-of-life emissions. We will also assign a carbon capture credit. Note that for many projects some of these emission categories will be empty in one or both scenarios. In order to be able to calculate our reference emissions, we first need to determine what our reference scenario is. The reference scenario is intended to reflect the emissions that would be incurred to deliver the same service that a project delivers under a conventional production system. The reference scenario must always be chosen from the 9 possible reference cases detailed in the GHG emissions methodology. In the case of methanol, there is no EU ETS product benchmark value available, which means that we will have to find another basis for the reference. Case 6 is applicable here. Methanol can be synthesized from natural gas, and the GHG methodology tells us that we can use a reference emission intensity of 97.1 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule of methanol. Before we move on to the calculation, please note that some projects will produce principal products that are physically different from their conventional alternatives. In such cases, we would have to identify conventional products delivering an equivalent function. For example, if a project supplied all of its produced methanol as a gasoline blend stock for transport use, then case 4, transport fuel substitutes, might be appropriate, as the methanol is providing an equivalent function to a conventional transport fuel. Going to the Reference Emissions tab of the tool, we see that I have already prepared a row in the Processes section to include our methanol reference emissions data. First, have data on the expected annual methanol production. I've highlighted the third year, which is the year our project is expected to reach full production. You can see that I have set the subsequent years to use the same production value as the third year. The first and second years, on the other hand, have formula referencing our assumptions, where we assumed 50% capacity for the first year and 75% capacity for the second year. For this example, we VE set the full project output at 100,000 tons per year in the Assumptions tab. Second, we are going to set the emission factor for our methanol. The reference value for methanol has been included for your convenience in the Ref Conversion Factors tab. We can use that to create a formula to reference the relevant value. In order to convert that value to tons of CO2 per ton of methanol, we multiply by the lower heating value of methanol which is included on the Proj Conversion Factors tab and divide by 1000. Using formula to link your data together in this way will help the evaluators to understand your calculation. If the evaluators are unable to follow your calculations, it could reduce your likelihood of a successful application. In the case of our example methanol project, the methanol reference emission value is the only emission value that we need for the reference emissions calculation. The methanol emission factor is based on life cycle analysis. This implicitly includes the end-of-life emissions, which result from the oxidation of the carbon in methanol molecules to CO2. It also includes the emissions from the inputs and energy consumed in the methanol production process. Having entered our production rate and our emission intensity, the annual and the total reference emissions are calculated here to the right. You can see that because I prepared this sheet with the necessary formula earlier, the emissions have already been automatically calculated. Note that when completing this sheet, you will have to fill in those calculations yourself. Having completed our reference emissions, we go to the Project Emissions tab to enter data to calculate the emissions in our project scenario. For the example, I've temporarily hidden all our processes and all but one of our inputs, so that we can focus on completing our first input row. There are no rules about which order you list your inputs and processes, but if you can choose a clear and logical order, it will help the evaluators understand your data. In this case, I'm starting with the biomethane input, which is the main source of energy into our production system. As you may recall, we already specified the annual biomethane consumption in the Assumptions tab. We can therefore create a formula to refer to that annual consumption. Having filled in our biomethane consumption, we must now enter an emissions intensity value for biomethane as an input. The emissions methodology says that for biomass inputs, we should use default emissions values from the Renewable Energy Directive, if possible. In this example, the biomethane is produced from biowaste in a system with closed digestate and no off-gas combustion. If we refer to Annex V of the Renewable Energy Directive, we can find that the default emission intensity for this pathway is 35 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule. In the Proj Conversion Factors tab, you'll see that I've already included this value in the Alternative Factors section. This is where you can add project-specific data. Again, we multiply by the lower heating value of methane and divide by 1000 to get the value into tons of CO2 per ton of biomethane. Let's now expand the rows to see the other inputs and the processes. I've prepared these rows already so that we don't have to go through and fill them in one by one. The input section includes lines for electricity and water production for our different processes, and a line for catalyst consumption. Note that even though we have a natural gas boiler in our system, we don't treat the natural gas going to the boiler as an input. Rather, the emissions from natural gas combustion are going to be included as a line in our process emissions. If we look to the right, we see that all of these other lines in our inputs are assigned emission factors of 0. Electricity used as an input for energy-intensive industries in the Innovation Fund is treated as a zero emissions input. This means that while you should still report expected electricity consumption, it will not affect the GHG performance of the project. Similarly, you can treat water as a zero emissions intensity input provided the project will not require the deployment of additional capacity for water desalination, wastewater treatment, or groundwater pumping. Finally, we have catalyst consumption, which we have set at 1 ton per year. Inputs whose emissions collectively amount to less than 5% of total input emissions may be treated as de minimis and disregarded, so we can also set the emission factor for the catalyst to 0. Note that in a real application, you'll need to justify the decision to treat any input as de minimis, for example by referring to an emission factor in a literature source or by showing that it is reasonable to assume that emissions associated with a given input are below a certain level. Underneath the Inputs section is the Processes section. Here we see processes listed for the natural gas boiler, including for heat supply to the partial oxidation reactor, for the carbon capture unit, and for the methanol synthesis unit. The boiler combusts natural gas, so its emissions are calculated using the CO2 equivalent emission factor for natural gas combustion. Under this is a line for the carbon capture unit to report the quantity of captured CO2 that is being fed to the methanol synthesizer. This is a zero-emission line because the net CO2 emissions associated with carbon capture are calculated on the separate carbon capture credit tabs, but we can still include it here to help document the flows through the system for the benefit of the evaluators. Finally, we have the methanol synthesis unit. The example assumes that there is a small amount of venting of unreacted CO2 from the POX reactor, and in the flue gas of the methanol synthesis unit. All CO2 from the POX reactor is biogenic. For the methanol synthesis unit, I have split the vented emissions across two lines to show the difference between CO2 from the biogenic carbon, originally from the biomethane, and CO2 from the fossil carbon supplied from the capture unit. Notice that even though the emission in row 34 is fossil carbon, it's been assigned an emission factor of 0 in this part of the workbook. That's because this loss of vented CO2 is going to be assessed using the carbon capture credit tabs. Including it as an emission term here would lead to double counting. The only other section where we have filled in data is the end of life section. As with the vented CO2 from the methanol synthesis unit, the end-of-life CO2 is divided into biogenic and non-biogenic fractions based on the number of carbon atoms entering the system. For this project, we are not entering anything into the change in-use emissions section. If we go back to the top of the tab, we can see that the summary table for process emissions is now evaluated. We have positive emission terms under Inputs, Processes, and End of Life. We have now finished filling in the project emissions and the reference emissions terms, but we still need to add a credit for carbon capture and utilization. The basic principle for calculating a carbon capture credit is to subtract the emissions from the capture process from the amount of CO2 that is either permanently stored or used in a product. In row 23, I have entered the amount of CO2 that is incorporated into the final product. I'm calculating this as the difference between the amount of captured fossil CO2 supplied into the methanol synthesis reactor and the amount of captured fossil CO2 that is vented from the reactor. Below this, we have calculated the emissions associated with running the capture equipment. We've assumed that the capture unit requires 1500 mJ of heat per ton of CO2 captured, and that this heat is supplied by natural gas combustion. We end up with a net carbon capture credit of 42,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year at full capacity. Going back to the Summary tab, we see that there are now values filled in row 20 and in row 27. These values detail the absolute GHG emissions avoidance and the relative GHG emission avoidance of the project. We have calculated that our project is delivering absolute GHG emission avoidance of about 1.2 million tons of CO2 emissions, as well as a 65% relative GHG avoidance compared to our conventional hydrogen production system. Thank you for watching this Innovation Fund tutorial. I hope that you found it useful. We invite you to revisit the calculator for energy-intensive industries, and any other calculators that you may need to use for your applications, in your own time. If after watching this tutorial and reviewing the tool you still have any questions, please do not hesitate to submit a question via the help desk if the answer to your question is not already included in the FAQs available on the Funding and Tenders portal. Please note though that the help desk will only answer questions related to the methodology or the utilization of the tool. Our team will not review your calculations for you and will not validate the assumptions that you intend to use for your project. Thank you very much for watching, and have a great day.